One of the things that I have noticed about being a parent is that action is not the same as an attitude, right? I can ask my children to do something, and there's the way that they could do it that I want them to, and there's an attitude with which they can do it that I don't want them to have. It seems that in this text that we're looking at here, in lesson number 3, the Father is concerned with shaping attitudes. As the Father instructs the Son, he's trying to not just shape the things that the Son does, but even the attitude that the Son has. And so often, our attitude is actually a demonstration of what's happening in our heart. It's our attitude that demonstrates actually what's going on below the surface, how we really feel about something, not just the thing that we are doing in and of itself. And so, in order to sort of teach this lesson or help us understand what's happening here, the Father introduces a couple of characters. And these are a little bit different than some of the characters we've encountered before. The characters the Father is introducing us to here in this specific lesson are actually teaching and commands. And I think what we'll find as we're moving through this text here is that these almost become personified as they work in the Son's life. The introduction here in this lesson number 3 goes from verses 1 through 4. And really it's a call to internalize and remember. Notice what the Father says in verse 1. "My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands." How often we forget the things that we have already learned. We should know that this is the way it works, that when we go in and we sit through a lesson or we have an encounter with some sort of important teaching, we should know that it's important enough to try to remember. And we should do the things that help us remember, that help us recall the things that we have learned. But the reality is, for many of us, we're just not very good at remembering what we've learned. I think back to all of my years of education and how much I have forgotten. I know some statistics out there say we only remember about 10% of what we learn and that is spoken in a classroom. And so if you can think back to some of your educational experiences, some of the things that you have heard people say, how much of that are you able to remember? How much are you able to recall? This, I think, is part of the reason that the Father tells the Son to not forget. He's trying to encourage him. Don't just listen to my words as if they're going in one ear and out the other, but rather you actually have to do the work to not forget. There's something that has to happen in your mind to help you not forget. Part of what I have done as a part of learning languages in sort of the world that I live in, whether it's biblical languages or foreign languages. Our family lived for a time overseas. Part of what I've done is try to understand the way that my mind works. How do people learn languages? And what I realized is it's actually more beneficial to learn a language by studying the vocabulary and letting some time pass. And as some time passes, your brain actually starts to forget some of those words. And it's at that point where you're starting to forget that you recall the words again. It's if you can develop some sort of spaced repetition system so that you learn something, you let some time pass until you're starting to forget it, then you study it again, then you let some more time pass until you're starting to forget it, then you learn it again. And if you can do that, the vocabulary element is more likely to stick in your mind. I think this is just the way our minds work, right? We tend to just forget easily unless we provide attention to the thing that we need to remember. And so I think what the Father is saying here is that he doesn't want the Son to hear these words as just another thing that Dad is saying, right? But rather to hear the words, to internalize the message, and then to do the work necessary to make sure that it stays remembered. And so, don't forget my teaching, he says. Let your heart keep my commands. Verse 2, for they will bring you many days, a full life, and well-being. Now, it seems on first read that this promises a quantity of life, many days, a full life, well-being. This seems like it's saying that long life will wait those who follow the Father's words. But what happens if that's not our experience? What happens about those people that we have known that have not lived a long life? Their days were cut all too short. Is it because perhaps they were secretly sinful? Did God judge them, or did they have a premature death because they were secretly engaged in some sort of practice or behavior that was wicked and sinful? No. I don't think that's a helpful way to think about this. And I think it's important for us to remember that Proverbs, although sometimes they seem as if they are blanket promises, they are not intended to be read in this way. These are not promises of good for us, regardless of circumstances. It is not a formula, as if A, you obey, then B, you will get long life. Rather, this is just the way the system generally works. And sort of life lived in a vacuum, all things being equal, this is the better path. You take this path, my words, the Father says, will bring you many days and a full life and well-being. In general, if you stay on this good path, if you follow this good way, in general, you'll find that life is good for you. But sometimes things happen. Sometimes there are exceptions to the general rule. And the Father's not trying to say that this is the way it always works, no matter what. And so, if you will listen to the Father's words and you'll experience some of these blessings, then he says, verse 3, never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. The words here, loyalty and faithfulness, are the Hebrew words chesed for loyalty and emet for faithfulness. And the idea here is that you're kind of attaching these things to you. You're surrounding yourself with them. Chesed is a word that is used several times throughout the Old Testament, and it's typically translated as something like steadfast love or loving kindness or something like that. But I think actually loyalty gets more at the heart of what this word actually means. Chesed is really referring to the commitment that one party has to another. And so as we see this word used several times throughout the Old Testament, it seems that what the authors are extolling or praising is God's faithfulness or loyalty to his promises. It doesn't necessarily seem to be God's warm feelings of love or compassion for his people that's in view when we use the word chesed, but rather it seems to be these moments when God is willing to honor a commitment that he has made. He is willing to recognize that there's some sort of relationship here that requires something from both parties, and God steps in. And what we find is that the chesed of God is greater than the chesed of people. God is so much more loyal than we are. And God's loyalty is one of those things that occurs all throughout the Old Testament as praiseworthy, right? The psalmists frequently praise the Lord for his loyalty, for his chesed. So if you will pursue good, if you will pursue these paths, the Father says, then you will find that loyalty is right there with you. Also, faithfulness. This is a sense of something being true or something being steadfast or firm. And I think what the Father seems to be suggesting here is that God's faithfulness and loyalty, these won't leave you if you will pursue the Father's paths, if you will pursue the way that the Father is setting out here. Most people think these refer to perhaps our own loyalty and faithfulness, that we should sort of preserve these things for ourselves. But Michael Fox thinks, and I tend to agree, that these actually might be God's own characteristics that we're concerned about keeping for ourselves. So keep them for us, right? Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Fox notes these are things that are possessed outwardly as a necklace, right? And internally written on your heart. Then you will find favor and high regard with God and people. This is an additional reward for the Son if he will make sure that he guards these things and protects these things and keeps them. And now we arrive at one of the the most famous passages in all of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. This is the beginning of the teaching section. And here's what the Father says. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. The admonition here is to trust with all of your heart. Now, we'll talk about this in another session, but heart is actually the seat of your intellect, not necessarily your emotions in the biblical Hebrew worldview. There's a way to talk about your emotions, but there seem to be other Hebrew words that they use for that. The word heart is really the place where you think. And so it seems trust the Lord with all of your heart is not simply an encouragement to trust God with your emotions, but rather to trust God with your intellect, with your mind, and don't rely on your own understanding. Why? Because life is complex. Now, we like for things to be pretty simplified, or we like to put things into categories, right? The way this works is often with color. We like to distinguish things based on color. In the world, there are many different languages, and linguists have studied some of the features of all of the different languages. One of the things that they have discovered is that all languages do not share the same words for color. In fact, in some languages, there are drastically fewer words for color than there are in other languages. In other words, there are some languages where there's no word for green, or there's no word for brown, or there's no word for pink, or there's no word for mother of pearl, right? We just don't have words for these colors in certain languages of the world. In fact, there's one language, Tsimane, I think I'm saying that correctly, that only has 3 words for color: black, white, and red. That's it. That's the only color words they have in the whole language. But you know what's true of every single language in the world? Even if they only have a few color words, every language at least has a word for black and a word for white. In other words, this essential contrast between something dark and something light is shared with all languages in the whole world, no matter what words they do have for color. The reason I think this is a reality is because we like to put things into categories. We like to separate them. There's a tendency in all of humanity, right, to place things into categories. But when you enter into real life, what you find is that life is actually complex. Life often doesn't fit into nice and neat categories. Everything is not so much just black and white. As we begin to live life, there's a whole lot of areas with a lot of gray. How do I begin to tell how I should live life, or how I should orient myself to life when I'm faced with so many complexities? Sure, if this is just a simple choice between what is right and what is wrong, then I usually know what to do. But sometimes the situations that life presents us with as we go through it are complex. Well, there's this factor to consider, and there's this factor to consider, and then there's this factor, and this factor, and this factor. And maybe in some situations, it's easy to know what is right and what is wrong. And maybe in other situations, it's really tough to know what the best thing is to do because of life's complexity. I think Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 is an invitation for us to orient ourselves to life with trust in a God who knows the complexities of life. Trust, it seems, involves hoping in God to work things out, even though life throws all sorts of things at us. Life is complex. But if we can listen to the voice of Proverbs, listen to the voice of the Father here in this lesson, we can begin to orient ourselves with trust. Trust in the Lord with all of your thinking, with all of your heart. Don't rely just on your own understanding. Why? Perhaps partially because we tend to put things in pretty sharp and distinct categories. But God, we trust, is able to see the complexities. He's able to discern the heart. This is part of the challenge of a judge, right? Someone who is administering a legal case. How do you begin to sort of pierce through the realities of the situation to get at the true motives? How can you begin to understand the heart of what's going on? If you remember the story of Solomon, the famous story, right, of Solomon's wisdom in his ruling, you have these two women who come, and one of them is accusing the other one of stealing her baby. She says, during the night, she rolled over and killed her baby, and now she's stolen my baby. And the other one says, no, it happened the other way. And there's this question, right? There's two women, there's a dead child, and there's a living child. And both women are claiming the living child as their own. How do you go about discerning who is telling the truth? When two people are saying two different things, this is the challenge of a judge. How do you administer justice with righteousness and equity when you're faced with the complexities of life? And so what Solomon does in this famous legal decision, right, is he declares, bring me a sword, I will cut the baby in two. And of course, this preposterous action is not, I don't think, intended to be actually carried out. But rather what Solomon is trying to do is he's trying to get at something deeper, which is a mother's love. He wants to know which woman really deeply, sincerely loves this child, the one who knows that child is her own. That woman will be able to give her child up if it means he can have life. And that's exactly what happens, right? When he brings out the sword and they begin to carry out the act, the true mother says, no. Just let her have the baby. It's better for the baby to live. And so Solomon's wisdom is displayed for all, because in this moment, he was sort of able to see the complexities of life. This, I think, is what wisdom provides for us. And if we remember from our last session, this is the thing that God himself gives. We get God's perspective on life as we begin to internalize wisdom more and more. And so what the Father is instructing the Son to do here is to trust in the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his thinking, to rely on God's understanding. In verse 6, he goes on to say, in all your ways, know him. Bring an awareness to him. Keep him in mind, I think is the idea. And he will make your paths straight. The biblical writers really seem to hope for God knowing and guiding and making the path straight, like we have heard about in Psalm chapter 1. So don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. This admonition then is to stay humble. Don't be wise for yourself. Verse 8, this will be healing for your body and strengthening for your bones. If you remain humble, this will be healing to you, even down to your bones. And so honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. Then your barns will be completely filled and your vats will overflow with new wine. In other words, if you will continue to trust the Lord, give the Lord proper weight in life, then all things will work out. Again, this isn't a promise, I don't think, but it is a guarantee of God's goodness. This is the way that it normally works for those who choose to trust in him. So, will you choose to trust in your own way, or will you choose to orient yourself to God? So, do not despise the Lord's instruction, my son, and do not loathe his discipline. Sometimes instruction is painful, but the Father's word to the Son is do not abandon it. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves. Here we get the summary. Just as a father disciplines the son in whom he delights. Here, the Father is encouraging the Son that the Lord actually loves you. His discipline in your life is actually a part of that. So you should submit to his work in your life. Notice the attitude shift that we're getting at here, right? Trust. Don't be independently wise. Fear the Lord. Avoid bad things. Honor the Lord. Don't despise. All of these attitudes manifest themselves then in our action. The Father here is concerned about us shaping our attitudes. In other words, as we invite teaching and commands into our life, they will begin to guide us, and they will begin to guard us, and they will begin to protect us. These two words from chapter 3, verse 1, the teaching and the commands that the Son is supposed to keep internalized within him, these will become guardians and guides along the way. They will protect the Son and will bring about not just regular life, but really a fullness of life in the middle of life's complexity. And so for us, I think there's a word here about learning to trust in the Lord, about learning to shift our attitudes away from a self-centered or a self-focused view of life to rather put on the lenses of wisdom, to be able to see life through wisdom's perspective. And as we do, as we trust in the Lord and submit ourselves to him, we find that he shifts and shapes our attitudes as well. When we are willing to submit ourselves to that, it leads us not just to a good life, but to a really full life as well.